So yeah, moving on to the exporting of a stereo file, which is for mastering. Again, it will be a lot of the time out of a DAW, so it's using the same sort of stuff that we're talking about. There are a couple of things which cross over between the two things we've talked about. One is the space at the beginning end of the file. It needs to be, if you've recorded audio, don't instinctively fade anything, or don't think that you need to edit everything down to the absolute, like the first beat, or cut it where everything's finished. Like, there's nothing wrong with having a little bit of mic preamp noise either side, as long as it's consistent. It's much easier to fade and edit consistent noise than to have to try and build into it. So one of the problems that I often have is a track will end and you'll have the end of the reverb and the end of all the stuff that's happened, and then you hear like a as everything turns off individually. It's much better to leave everything as it is and allow for the sort of psychoacoustic editing, which is, I can make something sound like it's silent if I can get from a point to a point. And that's at the start and end of tracks. And it's the sort of thing that people learn the hard way, where you think you've got absolutely everything perfect, you've exported everything, but you've chopped too hard either side. Or like almost every day I have to re-edit a fade at the end of a song where you've got a delay or a reverb or something which is just spinning out, and it sort of ends, or it goes on forever and then plateaus at a point. Right. And then I have to re-edit that. It's better to give me that than to try and sort of overcompensate when exporting. Also, be really careful with the locators. If you're using like MIDI or any sort of virtual instruments, you could think of your track starting at the point where the first clip starts, or at the end of where everything is. And you can do that thing on like most DAWs where you select everything, press a button, then it puts the locators around it. Yeah. You've got to be really careful with that first transient, because some of them actually chop off that very first bit. So if you've got a kick drum sample, instead of going dum, it will go hum. Yeah. Or at the end, you'll have that thing of like, you'll have like a slapback delay on something. It'll be completely tight apart from the last slapback. And it's a very frustrating sound. And it's the sort of thing, it's fine for a single and stuff when you just listen to it in isolation, but when you start to put your album together, like when you listen carefully to albums, you'll notice that there are little bits like this where things have been edited, or there's a little bit of an annoying change in the flow of the album. And in mastering, what we're trying to do is make that absolutely perfect. So a really good way to give me and people who are mastering more to work with is to give us that. And if you do have specific edits, fades, stuff that you like the sound of, or maybe the mixing person's done, then, like I said earlier, just give me that as well. A really good thing to do if you're doing an album is to do a mock-up of the album, if you have the skills to do that. And it could be rough and ready, and you could do the fades just in a sort of quick way. But if you want to just put it together and show where the gaps are and show how you want it to flow, or you want two tracks to bang into each other, describing that with language is quite difficult, but just sort of dropping it into different channels in a DAW is a really good way of just giving the information. Again, it's all about saving time doing phone calls or emails. And if there is something that I think is a bit odd, I can go back and say, try moving that a few milliseconds across, because I think it's not quite 4 beats and it sounds a bit strange. And you can just do that at your end, send it back. Whereas if you're talking over the phone about time, and all these abstract concepts of what flow is and stuff, then it can get quite difficult.
I suppose that, also things like screen grabs can be useful as well.
Yeah. So just to tie up the sort of exporting of stereo files, another thing to be really aware of is the overall output level. And there are a few things which people get very confused about. First thing is normalization. Essentially what normalization is you tell the computer to take the highest peak in the file and put it somewhere. So it could be like right up to the top, 0 dBs full scale, which is like the highest you can go level-wise, or it could be minus something. Now, there's a thing that's happened over the last decade or so, and I've done it myself as well, and I probably shouldn't have, where mastering engineers essentially trick people into not letting their audio clip by telling them a certain output level. In digital audio, the output level is basically irrelevant. As long as it's not clipping, you're cool. 24 bits, 32 bits has all the dynamic range you could ever need. So don't freak out and suddenly think you need to bounce the levels up or move your master fader or anything, the best thing to do is to export your file, load a new session, and load it back in as just a stereo file, because you can see if it's clipped and you can see if something's chopped off either end. And it allows you to also have a bit of a quality control listen to it as well. And I find that quite useful when I'm making music, to just bounce it, come back in, reload it, and just check that everything is as you expected. And if it does clip, go back and take it back by a few dBs on the master fader, bring it back in and check it. And don't start trying to move stuff around within the session, because you'll end up accidentally skewing stuff. And
I think that's a really good point, just for people to if you want to give your mix that one last check as well, doing it without the mix open in front of you, it can be a really useful creative process of being able to hear something without being able to tweak or change it. Can actually be really, like, it can really hammer home whether there is a real problem, because whether you can be bothered to open the session up again and tweak it, or whether you're just like, no, I think that's fine. So in terms of what people should look for if they are bringing that waveform back in after bouncing it down, you are looking for it hitting the top of the graphical display of the waveform and truncating into a sort of, so the wave, which normally would be a nice curve, maybe just gets up to the top. It can't go any louder, and it becomes a straight line and then down. The only thing that you should be aware of is that some DAWs will have different zoom settings where you can make the waveform look bigger or smaller. So don't think that this is like a hard and fast kind of, oh, that means it's at that level. What you're looking for is the shape of the waveforms. So bring them down so that they're not reaching the very top of your waveform display, and then you'll see whether they are flatlined, in which case they've been truncated and you've clipped the output, or whether they are still nice and curvy and natural.
This would be a good opportunity to use computer skills and make something appear now that is clipped waveform. I've always wanted to do that.
Yep.
I've got it out of my system now.